The stock market crash of 1929 did not cause the Great Depression. It was only the visible spark of a financial system already soaked in fuel. On October 24, a wave of selling hit the New York Stock Exchange and erased billions of dollars within hours. 5 days later, Black Tuesday arrived as terrified investors rushed to sell shares that suddenly had almost no buyers. Photographs of stunned traders turned Wall Street into the enduring face of the disaster. But if falling stock prices caused everything, why did thousands of banks fail years after the first crash? To solve that mystery, we must go back 11 years to the shattered world left behind by the First World War. The war had transformed the United States from an international borrower into one of the world's largest creditors. Britain and France owed enormous sums to America, but their economies had been exhausted by 4 years of destruction. They expected Germany's reparation payments to provide the money they needed to repay their American debts. Germany did not have enough money, so it borrowed billions from American banks and investors. American dollars traveled to Germany, moved to Britain and France, and then returned to the United States as debt payments. It looked like money moving through a healthy global economy, but much of it was simply traveling in a circle. If American lending ever stopped, the entire chain could break. The financial system was already becoming fragile long before Wall Street collapsed. Back in the United States, the Roaring Twenties appeared to prove that prosperity had finally become permanent. Factories produced automobiles, radios, and household appliances faster and more cheaply than ever before. Advertising convinced families that these new products represented the modern life everyone deserved. But many households could afford that life only by buying now and promising to pay later. The same dependence on borrowed money spread to Wall Street, where investors purchased stocks with only a fraction of their own cash. As prices rose, people borrowed more money because they believed tomorrow's gains would cover today's debts. Rising stocks supported more borrowing, and more borrowing pushed stocks even higher. It appeared to be a machine that created wealth, but the machine worked only while prices continued climbing. Then, in 1928, the Federal Reserve tried to slow the speculation by making credit harder to obtain. The stock market kept climbing, even as parts of the real economy quietly began losing strength. The financial system was already breaking before Wall Street collapsed, but almost nobody could see it yet. When confidence finally cracked in October 1929, leveraged investors received demands for money they did not have. They were forced to sell. Falling prices triggered more forced sales, and panic began feeding upon itself. Fortunes disappeared, businesses grew nervous, and consumers suddenly became afraid to spend. Yet America still had its factories, farms, railways, workers, and ability to produce real wealth. So why did a market panic become the deepest economic disaster in modern history? The answer was hiding inside thousands of small American banks. These banks held local mortgages, farm loans, and business debts, but they had no federal insurance protecting their depositors. When customers heard that a bank might be in trouble, they rushed to withdraw their savings before everyone else. No bank kept enough cash to repay every customer at once, because most deposits had already been loaned to other people. A rumor could therefore turn a healthy bank into a failing bank within a single day. One bank's collapse frightened customers at the next bank, and panic traveled from town to town. Families hid cash at home, businesses lost access to loans, and surviving banks became afraid to lend. Between 1930 and 1933, roughly 7,000 American banks suspended operations. The crash still was not the real problem. The greater danger was that the country's money was disappearing with its banks. Without loans, companies canceled investments, shops reduced orders, and factories dismissed workers. Unemployed workers spent less, falling sales caused more layoffs, and each round of damage created the next. Prices began falling because desperate businesses were competing for customers who had almost no money. Lower prices sounded helpful, but they made old debts much harder to repay. A farmer now had to sell more crops to make the same mortgage payment, even as the value of the farm itself collapsed. The Federal Reserve could have pushed more emergency money into the banking system, but its response was too limited and too slow. Some officials believed failing banks should face the consequences of their own mistakes. While policymakers debated, the American money supply shrank by nearly 30%. And just when the crisis seemed impossible to contain, the hidden international debt chain began snapping. American banks stopped lending to Germany, Germany struggled to pay the Allies, and the Allies struggled to repay America. European investors searched for safety, governments fought to protect their gold, and credit became even harder to obtain. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, increasing fears that the United States might eventually do the same. America defended the dollar by tightening credit, but that placed even more pressure on its struggling banks and borrowers. The crash still was not the real problem. Every attempt to protect one part of the system was damaging another. Trade barriers made matters worse, as the Smoot-Hawley tariff raised American taxes on thousands of imported products. Other countries retaliated, export markets disappeared, and indebted American farmers lost customers when they needed them most. By 1933, American output had fallen by approximately 29%. Unemployment had reached 25%, and the banking system was close to paralysis. Franklin Roosevelt responded with a national bank holiday, emergency banking laws, deposit insurance, and a break from the domestic limits of gold. Recovery began, but remained incomplete until wartime production finally returned millions of unemployed Americans to work. The Great Depression was not caused by one terrible day on Wall Street, but by debt, fragile banks, vanishing money, policy mistakes, and a broken global system. The crash was only the spark. The financial system built during the previous decade was the fuel that allowed it to burn across the world.